Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight's story never left the terminal. It happened in a VIP lounge most people will never set foot in, and it stayed with me since the day I heard it. This is the story of the Meridian Club at Gate D. Elliot Marsh arrived at the Meridian Club Lounge at Charlotte Douglas International wearing a plain navy quarter-zip, dark jeans, and a pair of sneakers he'd had for 3 years, carrying nothing but a leather backpack and a laptop bag. He looked, to anyone glancing his way, like an unremarkable business traveler killing 2 hours before a connecting flight. Nobody in that lounge. Not the receptionist who scanned his card, not the servers moving between tables, not the manager on duty, recognized him, which was exactly how Elliot preferred it, and exactly why he'd built the habit of visiting his own company's premium lounges, unannounced, 3 or 4 times a year, on ordinary weekday afternoons, when nobody had any reason to expect him. Elliot Marsh was the founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Airways, a mid-sized domestic carrier he'd built over 19 years, from a 2-plane charter operation into one of the more respected names in American commercial aviation. The Meridian Club lounges, 22 of them now, in airports across the country, were his personal project. Launched 11 years earlier, on a simple principle he'd stated plainly to the design team at the time. The people who fly with us the most should feel the most taken care of, not just the most upgraded. He'd built the first lounge himself, quite literally, spending weeks on site during construction, tasting every item on the proposed menu personally, sitting in every chair to test comfort, because he believed, genuinely, not as a marketing line, that hospitality was a promise, and broken promises cost you more than money. He checked in at the reception desk, presenting his elite status card under a slightly abbreviated version of his legal name that the system recognized, but that meant nothing to the young woman scanning it. "Welcome to the Meridian Club, sir. Buffets to your right, bars straight ahead. Let us know if you need anything." He thanked her and moved toward the dining area, settling at a small table near the window with a clear view of the tarmac, the way he always did. He liked watching the ground crews work while he ate. It kept him honest about what his company actually looked like from the outside, not the version summarized in quarterly reports. He took a small plate from the buffet stack and walked the length of the spread. A modest but respectable lunch service, sandwiches, a hot bar with a few entrees, a fruit and salad station, pastries near the coffee. He selected a chicken dish from the hot bar, a small side salad, and returned to his table. He didn't get more than 2 bites in before he knew something was wrong. The chicken had a faint sourness underneath the seasoning, the specific off note that comes from something held too long at the wrong temperature rather than simply overcooked. Elliot set his fork down carefully, not making a scene, and examined the plate more closely. The salad greens beneath the chicken had gone slightly slick at the edges, the telltale sign of produce well past its useful life, masked under a heavier dressing than the dish probably needed. He'd eaten in enough of his own lounges, and enough competitor lounges besides, to know the difference between an off day in the kitchen and something that had been quietly wrong for a while. He flagged down a passing server, a young man named Diego Ruiz, badge reading 2 months of employment. "Excuse me, could I ask about the chicken dish today? It tastes like it might be past its window." Diego glanced at the plate, then at Elliot, his expression shifting into the particular professional blankness of someone who'd learned not to argue with customers, but also not to take complaints too seriously if they came from a passenger who didn't look like he mattered much. "I can bring you something else if you'd like, sir. Maybe try the sandwiches instead?" "I'd like to understand what happened with the chicken specifically," Elliot said, keeping his tone even, curious rather than confrontational. "Was this made fresh today?" Diego hesitated, glancing back toward the kitchen pass-through. "I believe so. I can check with the kitchen. I'd appreciate that." Diego disappeared toward the back, and Elliot sat quietly, watching the buffet line, watching other passengers move through it without apparent concern, mostly because, he suspected, most people didn't send food back in an airport lounge. Assumed slight blandness or an unusual texture was simply part of institutional catering, and moved on without a second thought. A woman 2 tables over, a frequent flyer type in a tailored blazer, had the same chicken dish on her plate, largely untouched, pushed to one side. She caught Elliot's eye briefly, gave a small, resigned shrug, the universal gesture of someone who'd decided complaining wasn't worth the effort. Diego returned a few minutes later without a manager, carrying a slightly apologetic expression that didn't quite reach conviction. "Kitchen says it should be fine, sir. It was prepped this morning, but I can absolutely get you something else if you're not comfortable with it." "When was it actually cooked, though? Prepped and cooked aren't always the same thing." Diego's professional blankness flickered, just slightly. I'm not totally sure, sir. I can find out. Elliot decided to let it go for the moment, more interested now in observing the pattern than in resolving his own meal. He ordered a coffee instead, and while he waited, he quietly began doing what he'd trained himself to do in these unannounced visits, watching, without appearing to watch, cataloging small details the way he would in any operational review. He noticed the hot bar hadn't been refreshed in the 20 minutes he'd been seated, the chafing dish liners looking tired, the serving spoons crusted at the edges. He noticed a "Best enjoyed by" label peeling off the edge of a nearby pastry case, the date beneath it smudged just enough to be difficult to read at a glance, deliberately or not, he couldn't yet tell. He noticed the lounge manager, a woman in her 40s named Sherry Coburn, standing near the bar area for most of his observation window, engaged mostly in conversation with two staff members rather than moving through the dining area herself. He waved Sherry over eventually, catching her attention with a raised hand rather than calling out. "I understand there was a concern about the chicken," Sherry said, arriving at his table with the specific brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to smoothing over complaints quickly rather than investigating them. "I'm happy to comp your meal, of course. These things happen sometimes with catering deliveries." "I appreciate that," Elliot said, "but I'm more curious about the process. How often does the hot bar get refreshed during a shift? And when was this batch actually prepared?" Sherry's brisk efficiency faltered slightly at the specificity of the question. "I'd have to check with kitchen staff on the exact timing. We generally aim to refresh every 2 hours, give or take, depending on volume." "Is that documented anywhere? Temperature logs? Prep timestamps?" "We have logs, yes. I don't have them memorized, obviously." A small, tight laugh, the kind meant to diffuse tension that Elliot's questions weren't actually generating on his end, only on hers. "Would you mind pulling them? I'd genuinely like to see today's." Sherry studied him for a moment longer than felt entirely comfortable, something in his calm persistence clearly striking her as unusual for an ordinary passenger complaint. "May I ask why this matters so much to you, sir?" "It's chicken. I've offered to replace it." Elliot considered his answer carefully, aware that the moment for full honesty hadn't quite arrived yet, that he wanted to see a little more first. "I travel through lounges like this constantly. I care about food safety more than most people, I suppose. Humor me." Sherry disappeared toward the back office, returning 10 minutes later with a printed sheet, her expression noticeably less relaxed than it had been. "Here's today's prep log." Elliot studied it. The chicken dish currently on the buffet had a prep timestamp from the previous evening, roughly 18 hours earlier, well outside any reasonable hold time for a hot food item, even accounting for proper refrigeration and reheating protocols, which the log itself didn't indicate had actually happened. "This says yesterday evening," Elliot said, keeping his voice level despite the small, cold anger settling in his chest. "That's not a same-day prep issue. That's a holding and rotation issue." Sherry's composure cracked slightly. "We've had some staffing shortages this month. Sometimes items get held longer than ideal because we don't have the kitchen coverage to prep fresh batches as often as the schedule calls for." "How long has that been happening?" "On and off. A few months, maybe. I've flagged it to regional a couple times. Nothing's really changed." Elliot sat with that for a moment, watching Sherry's face carefully, reading genuine frustration underneath the defensiveness, the specific exhaustion of someone who'd tried to raise a real problem through proper channels and watched it go nowhere. "Who's your regional contact?" "Bill Sanchez, Regional Operations Manager, Southeast Lounges." Elliot nodded slowly, filing the name away. He reached into his laptop bag, retrieved a slim leather wallet, and pulled out a business card he almost never had reason to hand over in person, sliding it across the table. Sherry picked it up, read it once, then read it again more slowly, her face draining of color in stages. "Elliot Marsh, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Airways. I served you a—" "Oh my God." Sherry's hand went briefly to her mouth. "Mr. Marsh, I had no idea, if I'd known." "That's exactly the problem," Elliot said, not unkindly but without softening it either. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was to take this seriously. Every passenger in this lounge deserves the same standard you'd have given me if you'd recognized my name from the start." Elliot didn't leave the lounge that afternoon. Instead, he asked Sherry to walk him through the kitchen directly, not as a customer anymore, but as the person whose name was on the building lease. What he found back there told a fuller story than the prep log alone had. A walk-in refrigerator with a malfunctioning thermostat that had been reported to maintenance 3 separate times over 6 weeks without resolution. A kitchen staffed at roughly 60% of its intended headcount. A shortfall Sherry had escalated repeatedly, documented in emails Elliot asked her to forward him on the spot. A produce delivery schedule that had been quietly reduced from 3 times weekly to twice. a cost-cutting decision made at the regional level that nobody had bothered to explain to the people actually running the kitchen day to day. None of it was any single person's deliberate cruelty. It was something worse, in a way, a slow accumulation of shortcuts and unaddressed problems that had settled into the lounge's daily operations until spoiled chicken on a buffet line had become, quietly, just how things worked now. Elliot called Bill Sanchez directly from Sherry's office, putting the call on speaker with Sherry present. "Bill, it's Elliot Marsh. I'm standing in your Charlotte Lounge kitchen right now. I need you to explain to me why a broken walk-in has gone unaddressed for 6 weeks, despite 3 service requests." The silence on the other end lasted a long moment. "Mr. Marsh, I wasn't aware you were on site. Let me pull up the maintenance tickets." "I don't need you to pull anything up. I need you to explain why this lounge has been running short-staffed and undersupplied for months, while charging full membership rates to people who trust that the food here is safe. And I need to understand whether this is isolated to Charlotte or whether I need to be worried about all 22 lounges." Another long pause. It's been a cost management directive from corporate, sir. Reduce lounge operating expenses by 12% this fiscal year. I was told it came from the executive level. Elliot felt something settle in his chest, cold and clear. "It didn't come from me. Send me the directive. I want to know exactly who authorized a 12% cut to food safety and staffing without my sign-off." The Meridian Club Lounge at Charlotte Douglas closed for a full operational review the following Monday. Not permanently, but completely, for 11 days. The longest closure any Meridian lounge had undergone since opening. Elliot personally oversaw the review, flying in twice that week, walking every shift, interviewing every staff member who'd worked there in the past 6 months, Sherry included. The investigation that followed traced the cost-cutting directive back 3 levels of management, landing eventually on a regional vice president who'd approved the 12% reduction without ever setting foot in a single affected lounge, treating the number as a spreadsheet line item rather than a decision that touched real refrigerators, real staffing levels, and real food sitting on real plates in front of real people. That vice president was let go within the month, along with 2 others who'd signed off on similar cuts across different regions without adequate oversight. Sherry Coburn, whose emails and documented complaints had gone ignored for months by everyone above her, was promoted instead, moved into a newly created role overseeing food safety compliance across all 22 Meridian Club locations, a position Elliot created specifically because she was the only person in the entire chain who'd actually tried to fix the problem before it reached him. Diego Ruiz kept his job, and months later, during a follow-up visit, told Elliot directly that the moment had changed how he thought about speaking up at work, that he'd been trained, without anyone saying it outright, to smooth over complaints rather than actually investigate them, and that watching Elliot refuse to accept the easy answer had taught him something he intended to carry into every job he ever held. The lounge reopened with a fully renovated kitchen, restored staffing levels, and a new produce delivery contract that Elliot personally reviewed, line by line, before signing. He returned 3 months later, unannounced again, dressed the same plain, unremarkable way he always traveled, and ordered the same chicken dish from the hot bar. It was, this time, exactly what it should have been all along. That's the story of the Meridian Club at Gate D. Elliot Marsh didn't need anyone to recognize his name to know something was wrong. He just needed to sit down, order lunch like anyone else, and pay close enough attention to notice what a company starts to look like when nobody's watching closely anymore. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt, but it's what happens on the ground, in the quiet corners nobody thinks to check, that tells you who a company really is when it believes no one important is looking. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's always another flight, and always something worth checking twice before you decide it's fine.